This is the Recruit the Employer podcast, and you're listening to episode 100, How to Incorporate Your Faith at Work. Welcome to the Recruit the Employer podcast, a show for the ambitious, action-oriented career woman who wants to live out her purpose, rise to the top of her industry, and be seen as a leader at work. In 30 minutes or less, we'll walk you through the latest strategies to land your dream job, blast through imposter syndrome, and make the money you deserve. I'm your host, Jena ex-Wall Streeter turned career coach and founder of Recruit the Employer. But more importantly, I'm on a mission to help you fall in love with your work again. So grab a glass of wine, get ready to be coached, and tune in to your weekly boost of career confidence. Hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of Recruit the Employer. And in fact, we are today having the 100th episode of Recruit the Employer, formerly known and originally started as Your Career Story, but now Recruit the Employer. And instead of me interviewing somebody else or doing a solo episode for our 100th episode, I wanted to bring on one of my dearest business friends and just life friends in general, Elizabeth McCravey. I actually got the privilege of doing her 100th episode and flipping the mic and asking her some questions. So for those of you that don't know, if you follow me on Instagram, you probably know, but Elizabeth is a website designer extraordinaire. She's just an amazing businesswoman and someone I admire personally and really go to for a lot of advice. So it's so fun to have you here, Elizabeth, to interview me on my podcast, which is weird.
Oh my gosh, that was the best intro. We were just talking about like, how do we intro this? Because now Jena is giving me control here. But Jena, welcome to your own podcast.
Thank you for having me on my own podcast.
Yes. And I know you told me the same thing, but I want to say it to you as well of like, congrats on 100 episodes because we both know, I remember when you started your podcast, like about right before I did, I think.
Yes, but you hit 100 way before me because you were way more diligent.
I do it every week, I guess, instead of seasons. But yeah, we both know like that's a lot. Like getting to 100 episodes, it's really easy to like quit at some point before then. So huge
resiliency and persistence. That's the way to be.
Yes. And for you guys listening, Jena has some great questions that she gave me, many that you guys sent her about faith and work. And before we get to the faith and work conversation, I do have like a fun question or two to talk about that's a little different. But I do want to say I really love this topic. And I thought it was so fun when you said that like you wanted this to be what we talked about for your 100th episode. And you've come on my podcast to talk about this before, where I interview you. I think the title was like literally Faith and Work with Jena. So it's such an amazing topic. One, I feel like people don't talk about enough. And you're also like the person I think of when I think of it, of like someone who has a lot of wisdom around it and a lot to say and a lot of great advice. So I'm really excited for everyone listening and for myself to get to like hear all these. Yeah.
And it's not something I talk about people know it about me, but it's not something that I'm doing podcast episode after podcast. I'm not teaching on that, right? It's a part of who I am, but I wanted my 100th episode. When I was thinking about what I want it to be about, I feel like I talk about Brent a lot on my Instagram and stuff. And so I'm like, well, maybe I would just talk about faith and work because that's really important to me. So I thank you for interviewing me on it.
And have you had a podcast episode on this yet?
I think I had. Well, I had my friend Steph J come on and she talked about your calling and she's a believer. And so she had a lot of really great wisdom around that. So it was kind of around faith and work and she dropped some great truth bombs in there. So if you want to go back and listen to that episode, I can't remember what it is off the top of my head. We'll put it in the show notes. But beyond that, I really don't think, maybe in my early days I tried one, but not really, I would say. Not a full episode on it, for sure not.
Yeah, I couldn't find anywhere I was like, this is Jena talking about it, looking through yours. So yeah, that's awesome. Okay, so before we get into the faith and work questions, I have two starting questions. We'll do them kind of a little rapid fire way.
Okay.
What did you want to be when you grew up, when you were a kid?
Mariah Carey and Oprah Winfrey.
We'll just be them collectively.
I literally wanted to be Mariah Carey when I was little. So my mom listened to Mariah Carey. I grew up listening to her Fantasy. I think it was Fantasy album. That was her first one. Yeah. I don't know. Always Be My Baby, whatever album that one was. And I remember turning to my mom and being like, I'm going to be famous like Mariah Carey. I want to be Mariah Carey. And my mom's like, well, fame probably isn't like the thing we need to be focused. And I told her as like, probably like a 7-year-old, you just don't appreciate my dreams. And then I watched Oprah for years and years and years as a kid. I would come home and I would click on the television, and as a middle school and high schooler, I would watch the Oprah Winfrey Show. And so I wanted to be Oprah and I wanted to be Mariah Carey.
See, I can see little glimpses of both of those.
Isn't that funny?
For sure.
Isn't that so fun? I like think about that. I'm like, I didn't really want to be a doctor or a lawyer or even a businesswoman. Like I could see some entrepreneurial tendencies as a kid for sure, but I wanted to be Oprah and I wanted to be Mariah Carey. So there's that.
I love that. I love it. Okay. Another quick personal question. You're a newlywed. Yes. I still call you in the newlywed phase, right?
Yeah, we're like 7 months in or something like that. I don't even know.
So I know you and I have talked about your marriage stuff like 1,000 times now, but for everyone listening, what would you say has been like the most unexpected thing about marriage?
Yeah, well, I mean, we got married during COVID, which was like, you know, but what I will say is our actual wedding day for our first wedding, we're having our sequel wedding next year with our, later this year with our grandparents and our friends, and we're going to celebrate well that way. But it was our wedding day was such a beautiful day. It was such a great time for our immediate families because it was just our immediate families, like siblings, their significant others, and our parents. And then the pastor who from New York actually him and his wife drove down to marry us, which was such a blessing too. So it was just if COVID hadn't happened, I look at it in a very positive light, where if COVID hadn't happened, we wouldn't have seen the like beauty of that intimate moment. We wouldn't have had more peace around that whole entire day because during those, we could really settle into the emotion of it. And we wouldn't have been able to see like the kindness of people in offering things and giving us things and just their generosity during that time period. So I would say from a wedding day perspective, that was awesome and definitely unexpected because I thought I was going to be, this is terrible. It's not what I wanted, you know? And then I would say marriage in general, and I've posted about this, but it's like a combination of like, oh my gosh, this is so much fun. And oh my gosh, why do you do things like that?
I saw your post about that from a few days ago.
Yes. And like, it's mostly I'm the problem, but because because I focus so heavily at work and being organized and following up with, I have so many clients, I'm just very organized, But then when it comes to my actual like living situation, it's like the last thing on my to-do list. And so, yes, I forget to close most doors. I forget to load the dishwasher or press the button to make it go. Or like the laundry's in there a little bit too long. And so it definitely frustrates my husband, but he's very gracious. So I will say it's mostly me, but he's got some quirks too. So
it's so funny when I read your post, I related to that so much because literally this morning, Adam's my husband for people listening. He asked, could I please just stop leaving out all the meals I ate that day on the counter for when he gets home? Cause I'm pregnant. I'm pregnant. I'm trying to run a business. Let
me do my thing.
Yeah.
Like game is over for Brett when I'm pregnant because it's going to be like, sorry, I got the pregnancy card. Like you're just going to have to let it all go because my brain can't handle it.
Yes. Oh my gosh. I love that. Okay. So those are really fun. And everything else we're about to keep talking about is really fun. But this next one will feel like more of a serious question, but I know, so I still remember to start. I remember when you first shared your testimony with me. Mm-hmm. You might not remember this, but we were at Sopapia's during happy hour.
Gosh, I don't remember.
Sitting outside. Yeah, I still remember. It was like early on in our friendship, I feel like.
Okay.
But I kind of ended up asking you, like, what's your story with becoming a Christian? And I remember still thinking like it was so unique because as someone who, like, I grew up in the church and became a Christian later in high school.
Yeah.
And we often think of like the time of becoming a Christian as like a church or some outside ministry being a huge piece of it, but that was not it for you.
No.
And it's so cool and so unique. And so I know this plays deeply into why you're interested in the faith and work topic. So for people who don't know your testimony, could you share your faith story?
Yeah. So, from an outsider's perspective, a lot of people are like, oh, you've been a Christian since a kid. You grew up going to church and you kind of were involved in different youth groups and I went to a camp in the summer. And I tried to start a Bible study in college, but like who allowed me to do that because I didn't know what the heck I was talking about. And I will honestly say that I went through the motions because I wanted to be what a person, like I wanted to think or be perceived like a Christian was perceived, but I didn't actually have any of that heart knowledge of who Jesus really was. So I would say for myself, from everybody externally, they're like, oh yeah, she's a Christian. And like to an extent on paper I was, but there's a very big difference between religiosity, which is what I felt like I was kind of in, it was got to be good. You got to check the check boxes. It's very legalistic, right? And then when I moved to New York, I really wasn't involved in a faith community. I was kind of, from myself, a little bit of a wild child, right? I was like really struggling with an eating disorder at the time. I was working in investment banking over, like crazy hours. I was a hot mess, drinking way too much. And I remember I was laying on the bathroom floor on a Saturday because I was working naturally. And I had just had an episode kind of with my eating disorder. And I remember saying, God, I don't know if you're real. Because my version of God at that time was like Tim Tebow poster in my cubicle. Like that's my version of like Christianity, right? Very surface level. There was no depth of relationship there. There was really no fruit in my life. And I remember saying, God, I don't know if you're real, but if you're real, you've got to get me out. I have to get out of here. You have to get me out of here. I don't know how you're going to do it, but you have to get me out of here. And there was a girl in my sorority from Lehigh, and she kind of a couple of weeks later was like, hey, you need to get out of there. I work at the New York Stock Exchange. We have this open role. I really think you should apply. You should do it. I'm like, whatever. If you want to send me people's names, like I have no time to prepare for this interview. And I remember I had been at the office the night before that interview at the New York Stock Exchange till like 2:00 in the morning, some crazy hours. And I had an 8 a.m. interview. I remember crying during that interview. I remember it was like the worst interview I've ever done in my entire life. But I landed the job, and I always joke. I actually still talk. I literally just was texting with my boss from there recently. And I remember saying that he saved me from investment banking. But really what I was saying was like, God actually saved me from investment banking. And it was while I was working at the New York Stock Exchange that there was a gentleman in my group, my larger group, who was a believer. He wasn't like in your face about it, but he was just vocal, and you just knew that about him. It was a part of his faith walk. His fiance ended up being his wife, obviously, worked at a church. And so I guess, was like asking around like, oh, does anyone go to a church? Because I was like, maybe I should explore this whole thing because God plucked me out of investment banking. I can't think of any other reason, right? And I remember him asking me to go to this event or something, this weekend retreat. And I was like, I'm not going with weird Christians. Like Christians are super weird. I'm definitely not going. Like, that's what I was thinking in my brain. Christians are super weird. They're super awkward. Like, absolutely not. I'm not doing it. Or they're super judgy, right? I had all these like preconceived notions about it. And I was like, I'm definitely not going. And he's like, no, I really think you should go. And he kept on pestering in a kind way. Until finally I was like, okay, I will go. I literally know nobody except for you on this trip, but I will go on a weekend away with a bunch of randos. So it was there on that trip that I met my mentor. I met other men and women that were really faithful, but also at the same time in industries that were similar to mine. And it was one of those moments where like, I always say that like I met Jesus on Wall Street. It was because of my coworker who kept inviting me that I really got to meet other people and be in community with other believers in New York City, that I really got to know who Jesus was and really understand the gospel in a way that I never understood growing up. And it went from being very like 2D on a piece of paper, let me check mark, yes, I'm a Christian, and let me show you how I can follow the rules, to actually having a deep connection with the Lord and really understanding what he had done for me. And then that being an outpouring into my life and kind of what I do, professionally, but also personally as well. It totally changed my entire life. Mm-hmm. So that's a long story about it. But I think all those kind of details are kind of important, especially if you're somebody who's listening, who's like, I definitely grew up as what I would call a Christian, but I don't ascribe to that anymore. Mm-hmm. And I really felt, looking back on that God was really pursuing me during that time. And I'm grateful for that. So
yeah. See, it's such a beautiful story. And I'm sure because I know I can relate to so many elements of that, of like growing up in the church, feeling like check boxes, and then having the Lord call you back to him in some really unexpected way through an unexpected person. Like, so beautiful. And so to connect to that, I mean, you kind of just told the answer in a way, but one question someone sent you was, why do you talk about faith and work?
Yeah. I mean, it obviously is very personal to me. It's a part of my own faith journey. And I think a lot of people have misconceptions of what it looks like to live out your faith at work. I think a lot of people think that you either have to be like, don't tell anyone about it, right? Don't tell anyone that you're a Christian, or you have to be a Bible beater, right? Let me throw a Bible on my first day of work onto your, your coworker's desk. A lot of people think it looks like that. And I really don't think it looks like either one. I think it's showing up authentically as yourself. So I think generally speaking, the church doesn't do, I hate making generalizations about the church at large, but there's not as many sermons, at least that I'm aware of, where preachers and pastors are talking about the place where you spend about 90,000 hours of your life. Yeah. We talk about relationships and faith and generosity, and we talk about all these different other puzzle pieces in marriage. And, I think it's really important to talk about faith and work and how do those two things combine, because it touches on our worth. It touches on, what we think about ourselves and how we operate in the world and mission and calling and all those different pieces of the puzzle. So for me, it's actually a very important piece for me personally, but then also just because I feel like there's a great need right now, especially in Christian communities, of how do I do that and do it well?
Yeah. And I mean, you just hit it so well that like work is where we spend most of our time. And so it's like that. And if your faith is important to you, you should be able to think about like, okay, how do those two things go together? And I know you just touched on this a little bit, but a question you also got was how do you think that Christians get the whole faith and work thing wrong? You just explained it really well. And I was curious of that too, of like, what can we do as Christians to like understand what this means better? What would you say?
Yeah, I think part of it too is thinking that in order to live out my faith at work, I have to become a minister or be in ministry. So like your husband was in ministry, right? That made sense for him, but it didn't make sense for you to be in full-time vocational ministry. And so I think a lot of people have this misconception where I'm only serving the Lord if I'm in a church, or if I'm working for a nonprofit, or if I'm in a mission type work, right? And that's part of it. But also people that are in accounting, you're still glorifying God with your work. Also, people who are in politics, you are still glorifying, hopefully, God with your work, right? Like with all industries, I see that there is an opportunity for God to be glorified with what he's gifted you with. So it's also thinking differently around like, think about the ways that God has uniquely gifted you versus me. Not in a comparison status, but like he's gifted you very uniquely. He's gifted me very uniquely. It would be unwise for me to try to steward your gifts that he's given you that he hasn't given me. So I see that happen a lot with people where they're going to want to. And so if you're listening to this might be you. You're like, I want to get better at these things, or I want to try and push myself into this industry or this job because it feels like the right thing to do when it's not really how God has gifted you. And so that's another piece of the puzzle where I feel like we get faith at work wrong, not only from what are we going into, but like also evaluating where we are and how God has uniquely gifted us. And I believe it's our responsibility to be able to identify what are those gifts that he's given me, and how do I steward those really, really well? And that may look like you're going into ministry full time, and it may also look like you're going into accounting, and you could just serve your coworkers that way, and both are beautiful.
Yes, I love that. That's so well said. And yeah, just that we're not as Christians all called to be in direct ministry roles, but our lives and our work can still be ministries and be glorifying to God, like you're saying. I'm literally skipping around even in my own question order because you keep saying things where I'm like, okay, that really relates well to this. But okay, so a question, this is one someone sent that I thought was a really good one. I'm very curious about your answer to, but let's talk about callings. Mm-hmm. So you actually did an Instagram post recently on March 9th. You should link to it in the show notes because it was a really good one. But in it, you were talking about the question like of how did you know career coaching was your calling? And I want to quote what you said. It might actually be your answer to this question a little bit, but I'm still going to go and quote it because it was so well said. Just thinking about like, okay, how do we know our calling? Like we're talking about like, what has God called us to? So you said that, you're not sure if career coaching is like your forever calling. However, I can identify that in this season of my life, it is my calling. Mm-hmm. I'm a big believer that you can have multiple callings throughout your life. And in fact, the only consistent calling throughout my entire life as a Christian should be to point people to Jesus. Everything else should go to support that. So I feel like that was so beautifully said. But the question you got was, how do you define a calling? And does your faith influence how you direct women to their callings?
Yeah, I think and here's why it's such an interesting question, because I actually don't love the word calling. It puts so much pressure on us to figure it out, right? And then we also feel like we have to have one calling our whole entire life. And if we don't have that one thing we're doing our whole entire life, we failed at life. And I just don't think that that's true. And I, you do see people who do have one calling maybe throughout their whole life, like Mother Teresa. That's like a very extreme example, but she had one calling her whole life was to serve people. And she did it in the capacity that she was awesome at, right? And she was gifted and God bless that. And all that stuff was really fantastic. I don't see myself as being someone that has one. When I think of a calling, I think of it more of like, what's a mission that I'm trying to impact, right? And as a believer, yeah, right now, my mission is impacting and empowering women in the workplace. That's my mission right now. I would say in general, and actually my pastor, if you look in the comments of that, he actually, I think, said something to the effect of your mission and your calling in general is empowering people. That's your, whatever modality that looks like right now, it's career coaching. In a few years, it could be something else. And so I think that we need to almost like, look at it even more from like a 100,000 foot view. And we try to make it into like a 10-foot view from the ground. And so I think we overcomplicate it for ourselves and thinking like, what's my calling? It's this big existential question. And we spend so much time thinking through it instead of just doing things to figure out what we like and doing things to figure out what God has is blessing. And we, to do things to figure out what we're actually good at and how he has gifted us. So I think those things are actually more important than trying to quote unquote, figure out your calling. What I will say is that when I'm working with women, I am asking very poignant questions to help them understand what are their interests, what do they want, and what are they good at? And I think there's a combination of all three of those things that really play into your overarching calling, but also from like a practical standpoint of what's the next thing for you right now. So like there's gonna be a different season of my life where my calling is gonna be empowering my children, right? Yeah. So I think that if we try to put it in a box too much, we stress ourselves out in the process. And I feel like Christians do that a lot because we feel like, am I not living out God's calling? And I'm like, congratulations, as he allowed you to move away from what you're doing. No, you're in your calling. Like you're doing the thing that you're supposed to be doing right now. And there needs to be some level of contentment, even as you're trying to grow into something else.
That was some good preaching.
Yeah. Sorry, I get really feisty.
No, that was great. See, and I think that's like something interesting too, that a lot of people in our generation struggle with because like our parents and grandparents, we watched them do the same career too their entire lives. Many of them at the same companies until they retire. But I feel like this is true for both of us and for many people listening. Like you might have a ton of different careers and your career paths, or if you're a business owner, your business might look different. But then you have like the calling of like whatever it is of like glorifying God through whatever the work is you're doing in that season.
Yeah. And I do think too, like I think about my skill set, and I've actually told this to my pastor's wife on the phone. So we've had lots of conversations about this recently. And I said, career coaching right now is the modality in which I empower people. But I would say that also part of my calling or my gifting and what I want to steward well in my gifting is that I'm really good at writing, I'm really good at speaking, and I'm really good at teaching. Like those are three things that I feel like I'm really good at. I want to continue to do more of that and refine that skill set because I know that that's different than other people. Other people don't have that gifting. I know that I have that gifting. So instead of me trying to fix the things that are necessarily wrong with me, right? Or they're not as good, like project management, I'm just not going to be a project manager. It's okay. To double down on the things that I'm really good at and to do more of that. And that feels more part of my calling than like a subject matter, I guess.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. That's really great. And I hope everyone who like has felt that struggle, like heard everything you're saying there and will rewind as needed.
Yeah. Give yourself some grace, people.
Yeah. Okay. So another question for you, thinking about how you incorporate your faith as a business owner, you got quite a few questions about that. So first one, do you bring your beliefs into consultations with a potential client or when you're working with a client? So both of those situations.
Yeah, no, not unless, and this is actually, it was more common of a question I would actually get from people who were interested in working with me earlier on in my business. I would say the majority of my people don't identify as Christians. Like probably about 95%. Now I'd say that number maybe has gone down to about 90%, but still like the large majority of people would not say that they are a practicing Christian or identify as a Jesus follower, right? Like they may label themselves as, grew up in a Catholic church or something, but they wouldn't necessarily label themselves as a Jesus follower. And so for me, it's not about preaching to them. I never preach to my clients. It's the only time that faith really comes up is if I'm sharing an example of a time when something like that happened to me, and it would be impossible for me to share honestly without sharing my faith. And so I'm not going to lie to someone because I'm uncomfortable that I'm worried about them feeling uncomfortable that I'm talking about faith, because it's just a part of my story. And I'm not pushing, to expecting them to believe it, or I'm not expecting them to agree with it or anything like that. I'm just sharing kind of a little bit more about that. And what's been really interesting is because I'm just open about it and matter of fact and not apologizing for it or not expecting them to agree or anything like that, it's allowed for some really interesting conversations from people who have not been in a church in a really long time and are just curious and ask some questions, or people that were hurt by the church and just are like, wow, I didn't realize this was hurting me so much. Like, thank you so much for your thoughts on that. It's just allowed for some interesting conversations. So no, I never bring it up unless the person wants to talk about it. And they have to be explicitly clear with me that they are a Christian and they want to talk about that. And that doesn't happen that often. I would like to talk about it more. I think it's interesting. And it's like, I want to, I think about it a lot, obviously, because it's been a huge part of my journey and how I compartmentalize and make certain choices. But no, I don't shove it down somebody's throat, because that's not going to help anybody nor evangelize anyone.
Yes, very true. Yeah. And a cool thing too about like having a business and being a believer is like, even if you never speak to the client or potential client about it, they might know that just through your social media, for example. And so like, y'all never talk about it, but they kind of know, okay, I know Jena is a Christian. And if they maybe did have like, difficulties in the church growing up or recently, or have felt estranged from God, or just not, or for whatever reason, you can be like a example. I don't love the word example there, but of like, here's a Christian there, they like you, they want to work with you. Maybe Christians are not all like whatever that experience was that was negative for them. Yeah.
And that's really what I try to make sure that I'm always communicating, right? Like, I never am going to sit there and judge somebody for a different perspective on anything. And I think that is different than perhaps what they're reading mainstream media is telling them, or what their personal experiences have been. And so I'm going to be myself, I'm going to be honest, but I'm never going to push it down somebody's throat. Yes. And only if it's applicable am I going to talk about it in a consult, and the person has to tell me that they want me to talk about it, basically. And so this next question someone sent relates heavily to all that. So you might kind of have the same answer even, but they asked, how do you know when to share about what you believe in and what you don't, when you are giving professional advice to women? So thinking about when you were like literally doing your career coaching, like how do you know when and when not to share? Yeah, I think part of it is you have to have built a relationship with the person too, right? Like, I'm not going to come out the gate and just on the first consult with somebody and be like, let me tell you about my church experience, right? Like, I'm not going to do that. But I think if I build a relationship with that person, there's been plenty of clients where I said, I was laid off during this experience, and I'd love to share with you, if you'd be willing, like a little bit about how I feel like God showed up for me. And this is just how I approach it and how I process through it. You don't have to process this way, but I just want to share, just for your reference, how I processed it. And it's more, again, just storytelling. It's more just sharing my experience if it's applicable, but not coming out of left field and being like, so Jesus, let me tell you a thing or two, right? That's unnatural. Don't be weird, people. And so I would say that it's more, I just want to be able to live my most authentic self if I'm running my own business. And that's a huge part of who I am and my story. So I can't not talk about it if it's applicable.
Yeah. Okay. I love that. I think that's great advice.
I think that's true for if you're in a 9-to-5 too. Yeah. Like, for instance, when I was interviewing at the Muse, they asked me what I did for fun. And I literally said, I was just honest and transparent. I said, on the weekends, I am very involved in my church. By that time I was very involved in my church. And I feel like I had that whole revelation when I was at the New York Stock Exchange, and I was honest about it and they were cool with it. It was no big deal. Right. And so even in conversations, and because I was willing to talk about it in a matter of fact way of just like, this is who I am. And I actually had people that were in the office that felt comfortable also to talk about their faith, which was awesome. So, and especially in a place like New York City, it's not common to be, nor normal to be a practicing Christian. And so what I love about New York that I kind of miss that you don't really get in the South is that when people say that they're a Christian and they tell you in New York City, you are like, oh, you're in. You're like all in on this Jesus thing because you don't have to be, right? Yeah. And so it was just nice that, I got to have those conversations with people who were like, yeah, I grew up in a church. They like slided in being like, yeah, so I went to church this weekend. I'm like, oh, tell me more, and just being a safe space for someone to process through or to go to if they have questions, and I'm just myself, I'm just being myself, and that's a part of me. So I can't hide it.
Yes, that's what you said. That's a part of me and I can't hide it. And yeah, like with the workplace, I mean, it can be so easy. I mean, I've had less corporate experience, by the way, than most people listening, but it can be really easy to never talk about your personal life. So you could never know that someone even is a Christian without that being brought up randomly. And then you might have someone else and then that could be something you talk about. And
it actually warms my heart. Like I would have like some coworkers who would like hear a song and they knew it was a Christian song and they would send it to me. And I was like, that's awesome. They're trying to relate. This is amazing. Do you know what I mean? Like it was just, what didn't have to be as awkward and weird as people make it out to be. And it doesn't have to be as detrimental as people think that it's going to be.
Yeah. Yeah. That's awesome. Okay. Another question that's a little bit like of a tougher one, maybe.
Yeah.
How often do you receive negative feedback about you being a Christian?
Yeah. I will say, knock on wood. I'm knocking on lots of wood right now. I have not received a ton. And that is honestly a shock to me, is probably as much as it is to the person who asked this question. So I posted recently a post on LinkedIn about being a Christian. I just basically wrote it, put it out there. I'm like, let's see what happens. And it was my top performing post of the entire last year. I think it had almost 200,000 views in like 2 weeks or something like that, something crazy for LinkedIn. And, my platform only has about 40,000 people that follow me. And so, well, that is a lot now. Yes, you're absolutely. But out of that comparison of 200,000 to 40,000, right? And so many positive, even people that were like, I don't believe that, but I respect that. I was honestly shocked. There was maybe one or two out of all the comments, like 700 comments or something, that were negative. And in those instances, I don't read them. I have a virtual assistant who kind of handles that. And if anything, it's been the opposite, where people have come up to me and been like, I'm so grateful that you shared that, because I never know if I can share it in the workplace, or like, I don't know if it's appropriate for me to even mention, because I'm afraid of what people are going to think of me, or they're going to have, let's be real. So Christians have given the, people some bad raps, right? The church has done things. Again, I hate using generalizations of the church, but because I love the church, but there's some things that cause people to hurt, right? And I think that there's a fear that if I say that I'm a Christian, they're going to let me in with these types of people, whatever those types of people are to you. And I know that can feel really overwhelming, but if I really think about what Jesus has done, that's really a small price to pay.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like if you really actually put in perspective and you really believe what you say you believe, which is a crazy thing to believe. Let's just put it out there, right? It's a crazy thing to believe. And then when you actually say, like, I'm actually standing by this, and I'm believing that Jesus did this, and I'm believing that he did this for me. And so if God is for me, then who really could be against me, right? There's that scripture about that. And so looking at it from that perspective, I think helps me too. And that is the one thing that I will never be ashamed of, never be ashamed of. So I would say, generally speaking, I don't get that much negative feedback. I will say, people has made snide comments to me before, like when I was in the workplace, of like, oh yeah, the Christian girl, or even girls from college, honestly. Awful. But I would say that's more of what it was, and less of people on the internet about me talking about it. So, I really don't get a ton of again, knock on wood, please, Jesus. I don't get a ton of negative feedback about it. Honestly, I got more negative feedback on LinkedIn about writing that business cards were dead. And you would have thought I said that they should, I don't know, jump off a bridge or something. So there's more controversial ones.
I agree with the business cards are dead thing. I literally put something in my course about that the other day.
They just don't do it. Somebody asked me for one the other day, and I said, you can find me on LinkedIn, connect with me there. Like, that's a way better place for me to connect with you. I'm not going to waste trees.
Yeah, totally. Okay. So you feel like you don't receive much negative feedback, which is great. But with that question too, so there's always the risk of it, right? And so what question someone asked was, how did you navigate the risk you take on a daily basis, vocalizing your openness and what you believe regarding your faith? Like, so how do you know that like someone could blow up and you could be like the next person that people
cancel
hate on? Yeah. That someone canceled. Yeah. So how do you deal with that?
It's hard. It is hard. Like, I will say, like, I'm not some superhuman, right? Like, I do fear somebody canceling me. That's a real fear. Like, I do have that fear. I think that would be illogical for me to say that I don't. I think it's a real thing right now. I think for all types of people in all types of areas, no one's immune, right? But I will say that there are a lot of things that's one thing that I would not be worried if I was canceled for. Do you know what I mean? Like if I'm canceled for other things, I'd be like, yeah, I would understand maybe. No, that's not even true. I don't believe in canceling anyways.
But I know what you mean. There's things where you would be like, I did do something wrong here possibly. And you feel something about that. Yeah.
I know how I operate, and I know that my faith is a huge part. I'm never going to apologize for that. Never going to apologize for it. I'm just not. And so when I think about that, people can cancel me for that, and they may not like me. I know people probably don't like me because of I'm a Christian, whatever, and their perception of what they think that means. But I'm okay with, I have to get to the point, and I actually heard Lauren Daigle talk about this. You have to get to the point where true freedom looks like being willing to let people misunderstand you. I'm getting there. I'm not always there, but I think that's a really great perspective to look at it. Is freedom is allowing people to misunderstand you. And there's a lot of misunderstanding that can happen digitally on a piece, on a post, on a whatever, there's a lot of ways to misunderstand people. And so I have to be rooted in who my identity is in. So again, Christianity is not really about like just playing by the rules. I really believe that Christianity is knowing who God says I am first. And then out of that belief, and especially for my people that are listening to more, I talk about mindset. Like if I really believe who God says I am, then I will operate from that perspective. If I don't really believe that God is for me or God defines my identity, I will let people on social media define my identity. I will let coworkers who think differently about me define, and I'm not always good at it. So I want to say this from a position of always growing and always learning. And I struggle with it for sure. Earlier this week, I was struggling with that idea of the phantoms that have never canceled me, but could cancel me one day. I think it's a real fear, but I also have to ground myself. That also reminds me that I'm not grounded and rooted enough in the truth. So yes. I don't know if that's helpful. Do you feel that way sometimes?
Yeah, no, I can relate to this question well. And I mean, I think you and I have talked about this, Jena, but like there's always a risk anytime you put yourself out there, whether that's in your business or in your personal life in your workplace. For me, when I get negative feedback just in general in my business, it helps to balance it with how much more positive feedback there is.
Sure.
And usually just knowing you don't know that person's whole story. Like I had someone getting mad at me about something in one of my emails last week. And it was about Instagram. Like it was like advice on Instagram marketing, like nothing controversial or anything like that.
Anybody can make anything controversial nowadays.
Yeah, that really was how that felt. But I, wrote this person back and was like as kind as I could be and understanding. And I actually did like try to explain myself and adjust what was said. And they just were not having it and like did not want to make up basically. And it's like, at some point you have to know like that might just be where that person is with it. And you have to like keep doing your thing.
Yeah, I actually there's something that as you were saying that I was thinking about, we did I've told you about this. We revamped a webinar that we did like back in November, I think it was. And I remember getting off the webinar and feeling like, I feel like I sold people. I was too salesy on that webinar. That did not feel good. I felt like it was not authentic. I followed some guru's format who I will not name, and I was just like, this doesn't feel like me. Well, I had a woman who nasty emailed me. And, I did what I could to remedy it. I actually offered, hey, I'll look at and I totally understand that you felt like you didn't get anything out of it. I'm sorry. I'll take that feedback for sure. Which I did. And I did change my webinar because one, that was bad feedback, but also I didn't feel good about it. And I knew that there was something going on, and I figured out like, oh, she actually was in between jobs and she was feeling super overwhelmed. And like, there was a whole other piece of the puzzle where just like, I don't know somebody's story who says something on social media. I don't know somebody else's, right? So like, they might not know mine and I might not know theirs. So I think that's important, kind of what you said, to think through those different pieces of the puzzle. So yeah, it's just hard.
All right. So I know some people can feel afraid that if they talk about their beliefs when they're like not a ministry, that they'll lose followers. So thinking both like about business owners or people in like corporate careers, but like that they're going to lose followers. So a question one of your listeners had that I really loved was, when you first began your podcast and started your career as a career coach, were you willing to lose followers if it meant you stayed true to who you were in terms of your faith?
Yes. And I will say that losing people because of that literally is never my concern. Actually, I don't actually ever think about that, because that's such a part of who I am and such a priority for me that I didn't really care if people didn't want to follow me because like I knew the people I was more worried about people that I knew judging me for posting about it a lot or being like, who's this girl think she is? Like that was more concerning to me about people that I actually knew versus like a potential client or followers or whatever. Like I was more concerned about people that I actually knew and their judgment and, thinking that I thought that I was holier than thou or something, which they may have, and they're entitled to that opinion. Right. I think that's more of a fear for me in general and just a fear that I probably had early on in my business. But I don't think I've ever worried about losing followers because maybe early on, now I definitely don't because I'm like the follower game is such a racket anyways. That it's such a like weird thing. And a lot of people, pay a lot of money for advertising to end up getting It's just like a huge different game than when I started, I think too, that nowadays I'm like, someone doesn't like what I said. I'm glad that they just unfollowed me and they didn't start trolling me like that. I'm actually grateful for, so for me, I don't think that I ever questioned talking about that. And I've never really had people give me an issue about it. And I've been transparent on other people's podcasts. Like I'll briefly drop it in there. And because again, I'm not going to, if people are willing to talk about other aspects of themselves, I feel comfortable that I should be allowed to also talk about the fact that I'm a Christian, as long as I'm not pushing it down anybody's throat, which I don't feel like I do. I feel like I just tell my story. And if somebody wants to talk about it, then I will talk about it. But if they don't, I'm never going to be like, so what are your thoughts on God? Like, I'm just not going to do that.
Yeah. And I mean, that's the truth. I think like we always think people care more and are more concerned with what we're doing than they typically are.
Yeah. So and then like, some people do surprise you where they're like, where did you come from? Why do you care?
Yeah, that's true. It can go both ways. But I know like what you just said about like you actually being more nervous about like someone you knew, like say from college or like this random, like that's always more of the fear when it comes to like how we show up on social media. I feel like more so than like how our potential clients are going to perceive us. So whether that's about faith or like it, or just being bold as a business owner, like so many things.
I think also it comes down to like, because you already have those relationships, even if you're not in a relationship with that individual or people, whatever anymore, it still hurts because you had a personal maybe relationship with them or you knew them at a different time of your life. And so, and because they don't journey with you, they only see the highlight reel or the reel that they're seeing. And so, and also because they're not your ideal client, most likely, then they're not going to probably resonate with your content and they may unfollow you. And like, that's okay. I think also being online has made me be not less open, but I'm not really vulnerable as I was in my earlier days until I've already processed through something where I feel like, early in my business, I would process through something as I was going through it online. And I don't think that's actually a healthy thing at all whatsoever. And I can look back and say I was unhealthy. So I know that's kind of a side tangent, but it all kind of relates in a lot of different ways where I feel like it's also being online has made me, really pay attention to who my friends are and who I tell things to. Like what happens online is a part of my life. It's not my whole life. Yes. And so I post what I feel comfortable posting and people may have an opinion about what I post or how I post or all those different things, but I have to be at the end of the day okay with it either way.
Yeah. Yeah, that's awesome. And I mean, you've done a great job of you took a long time off of Instagram for one.
Glorious. My husband's like, can you take off again?
Yeah, you've come back to it and still like, I know you might not feel this way, but like maintain probably more balance maybe than you felt like you were before that.
Totally.
That's a question I want to add in. Like for someone who feels like they're obsessed with social media, whether it be Instagram or something else. Like you did take a long time off. And I remember it was like significant to me when you did that because I was so used to like people I'm friends with knowing what was happening for me. And I'm like, oh yeah, Jena just texted me this, but like, she doesn't know because like she's not following me on Instagram right now. But
it was so alarming because one of my friends was pregnant and she wouldn't send me any like she was sending, I guess, all these pictures online. And I was like, what the heck?
Yes,
eventually she got the picture. Like, I'm not getting on until like the new year. That's like 6 months of me seeing. I want to see you pregnant. Can you just send me a picture?
Yeah. So for people who would like to do more distancing from social media, what advice would you give to someone on like starting that?
I think you just need to rip the bandage and do it. That's the honest answer because I personally, and I know this feels countercultural, just because of like my business is all very online. I hope to see a change where people start shutting down their accounts. That's what I actually hope for, because I think it's really, really unhealthy. We've seen it happen this year. It's just a different, it's like the cult of social media. I don't know. I just see it being really unhealthy for people. And so it's one of the reasons why I get off at 6 p.m. And I've stopped posting that I'm getting off at 6 p.m., but I'm getting off for the most part pretty much every day at 6 p.m. and getting off for the weekends and I know you've been getting off on the weekends too. Yep. I need it for my mental sanity, because what it does, I believe, is like, you don't realize how much you're sucked into this world of online stuff and caring about people who you may or may not know in real life and spend time with in real life and pay more attention to what's going on with them versus, and some of those things are important, right? Some of those big macro, big issues that we're seeing in the world are important, but not to the detriment of missing out on the people that are right next to you. Mm-hmm. And I wrote about this also, just like carrying the weight of your community versus carrying the weight of the entire social media world. And I feel like we've almost been programmed this year to carry the weight of the entire I just don't think it's healthy for us all the time. In certain instances, I want to be clear, it's important to care about what's going on globally, but not to the detriment that that's only what you're caring about and you're missing out on what's happening in your real life. So if you're somebody who's thinking about like, maybe I need to take some time off, if you're thinking about it, take the time off, because the answer is already yes. Yeah. Take off.
I love all that. And it can be like like you said, I've been doing weekends off, and it kind of just happened through me being like, I don't feel like posting and I don't feel like scrolling, but it can be hard sometimes as a business owner, because you feel like it's part of your work. And so you need to be plugged in all the time. But then it's like, we try to take Saturday and Sunday typically off anyway. So it's like, why don't you take off from that as well? So
I think it's just healthy for us to if you're already thinking, should I, you should. That's the answer. And just to rip the bandage and to do it, because you are not going to be missing out on as many things that you think you're going to be missing out on. Like it really, like if you, and that will require you to be more intentional with relationships, but that's the beauty of life. Like I want to be more in my real life and less in my online life as much as possible. So if you resonate with you, I'd say just do it. Take it.
I love it. I love it. Okay. So I have like 2-ish more questions for you, but I just wanted to really kind of wrap up the faith and work conversation for people listening who are like, I really love that. That sounds great. I'm interested in doing more like incorporation there. What are some practical ways that myself and people listening can integrate faith and work?
Yeah, I think first we've got to look internally and then do external things. So a lot of people will be like, give me the 5-step practical things. Like, what do I need to be doing? Do I need to journal through this thing, or do I need to talk to my coworker about Jesus? Like, no, actually, you should start with yourself and see where your idols are with your workplace. So like, do you have idols around pride, around money, around, important, there's so many areas that is your worth completely attached to your work. Like those are the things you should start processing through first before actually practically going out into the workplace and maybe talking about your faith. Like, do you feel comfortable talking about your faith? Why not? I would literally journal through that. I would think through that. And then from a practical standpoint, some things that I think that, we could do a whole podcast, probably episode on this, but some intentional rhythms of people who are great faith and work integrators. And this is, I will say, always something I'm working on. I'm not an expert at, so don't look to me as being your ideal person, but it's just something to process through yourself. Something that I think about is like Sabbath. Do you Sabbath? Truly, we were talking about that. Like, or do you take a day off? Or do you feel like you're always on? How do you create more boundaries? Sabbath is really important. It's literally a commandment. I think it's the 4th commandment, which is pretty important. We actually did a whole episode on Sabbath with Christy McClellan. It was like one of the first episodes I did. So you're going to have to scroll back way far. But she's a biblical culturalist who teaches the Bible from a Middle Eastern lens. And I can't recommend her studies enough. She just did one called Jesus and Women. Love it. So good. But she talked about Sabbath and how that's really important. So that's a practical thing that you can be integrating into your faith and work rhythm. The other thing is, how are you looking at money? So this is a touchy subject. Again, we could do a whole entire episode just on this, but looking at generosity as a part of why you work. So we don't think about that. We think about generosity from a perspective of like, I'm going to maybe tithe, right? We talk about tithing a lot in churches, but like, how do you do radical generosity? Like one of the things that Brent and I have as a goal of ours, and we're always praying into this, obviously, to see like when that makes sense, what that makes sense by, and is to live off of one of our salaries and give the other salary away. Like that's a goal of ours because we believe that God has blessed us with the work that we've been given and that it's not really just about us gaining wealth. It's not really why we're working. We're working so that we could also bless other people. And I try to practice that in our own personal life. And we've been trying to do more of that. It also helps you get rid of your scarcity mentality. Like it's a whole other thing we could talk about, but also in our business too, of like thinking about who, I just did my taxes and we had a pretty hefty like amount that we donated. We could have donated more though. To be perfectly honest, I was like, we could have donated more. And so I think thinking about your salary, not just as a way for you to just bless your family and to your own needs, but really as the opportunity to bless other people. So that's the second thing. And then I would say just ministering to your coworkers. What's it look like to get to know your coworkers as whole people? Doesn't have to be complicated. Get to know them as whole people. Show up for them when things are going on in their lives. Like show up for them, send them something, like just be a regular human that's a good human. Like that's showing the love of Christ to somebody in a very practical way. And those seem like, yeah, that's so obvious, but are you actually doing them? Like, that's my question. Cool. Yes, it's obvious. Are you doing them? And so being able to be present for those people, I'd say those are some practical things to be thinking about. So first internal, then some external rhythms.
Yeah. I feel like I need to like recap those for everyone listening. Those are all so good. I mean, the first one, do you feel comfortable talking about your faith? That's such a good question to ask. And I know from experience, I've had seasons of my life where I didn't. And it was like, why are you like, what's going on there? And that's something to pray and journal about, like you said, and then having a Sabbath and having boundaries around our schedule, and then money and being generous and being a part of why we work. I love how you put that, and like radical generosity and getting to know coworkers as whole people. That's all. Yeah. Great.
I probably have more, but those are the ones that I like think of at the top of my brain.
Yeah, those are awesome. And I hope everyone stayed till this point and gets to hear all those. Okay. So this might be our last question.
Okay. Let's do it.
So you've done 100 episodes.
Yes.
A question someone asked was, what is the largest roadblock you've had come across since you began your podcast in terms of remaining faithful to what you believe in? So like in this 100th episode span, what's been a roadblock?
I would say for me, the biggest roadblock is keeping going, even when numbers were small. Right. So like for me, I would say from a faith perspective, there's no roadblocks for me. I mean, I think I pretty much probably signified that. Like, I don't think about that as a roadblock. It's more like I'm my own roadblock. And so I would say keeping and maintaining momentum, when you're a one person show, I mean, I have some team members, but for the most part, I'm the one who has to do all this. Right. So, and you can probably relate to this. And especially if you're not getting immediate feedback from people or your numbers maybe aren't what you want them to be, I'd say just staying resilient in it. And I will say that has paid off, where I'm seeing so many more people that are, oh my gosh, I loved your episode on this. Oh, I've just been binge listening to everything that you've been saying. And that's really great, because also this can live on beyond if I do decide to change my calling, with what we were talking about before, like this podcast. And I'm very grateful for that. The opportunity that, people could listen to it and be inspired by it, encouraged by it. I've had people that have gotten jobs listening through the podcast, which is super encouraging. People who've been willing to negotiate, women who've been willing to negotiate their salary that never thought to do it before. We've had women who have had really hard conversations, who've chosen to start their own businesses. So that's been a really cool part of it. I think it's reminding myself when the days feel like, okay, I got to get this podcast out, that those people are on the other side listening. So
yeah, that's so good. Yeah. And it can be hard, like when you first start, of wanting it to maybe grow faster than it does and getting discouraged. With that too, on the opposite end, what's been your favorite part of having a podcast?
I don't like video. Not that I don't like video, just video feels like so much more work. Because you asked me today, like, are we going to do video? And I was like, yes, but my hair's not done and it's not going anywhere.
So when you said we weren't going to use the video, I was like, perfect. Putting on a sweatshirt right now.
So I love that I can just bring my microphone and talk into it. And I feel like it's a really great medium for me. I like to, write before, blog, but I do feel like I like the medium of speaking into a microphone. So maybe that's my Mariah Carey days, to just bring it full circle for us people. But I do like being able to convey and just content that way. So I think that's been a really fun thing for me. And it's fun that other people can listen to it. Like, I think my dad's listened to a couple episodes before. Like, you know,
so fun.
It's so fun. And like my kids might be one day able to listen to their mom. Like, I think that's kind of fun. That's a fun part of like having a digital footprint that I want to make sure that I'm remembering as well.
Yeah. It is, like you said a moment ago, it's timeless content. So it really can be something that stays forever as long as you keep paying your hosting software, and it can just be up for everyone to listen to. Yeah, I love that. I mean, you're such a great podcaster and such a great content creator and great on the mic. So I'm very proud of you and excited for you with these 100th episodes. And I guess that's it. I mean, I guess we'll exit from the show, but seriously, congrats. And thanks for letting me interview you. And I hope everyone listening has enjoyed this conversation. I know I've like gotten so much of it and feel very like refreshed. Just like last time when you were on my podcast talking about this, I'm like, I feel refreshed thinking about faith and work. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on my own podcast and for you willing to interview me. All right, guys, we will see you next week on the Recruit the Employer podcast. I can't wait to see you then. Thanks for listening to the Recruit the Employer podcast. If you've been loving this podcast and it's been helping you approach your career in a brand new way, I have 2 shameless asks. Number 1, make sure you hit subscribe right this very second. That way you won't miss a single episode. And number 2, would you give us a review? Reviews help other ambitious career women like you know that this podcast is the place to be and helps the podcast climb to the top of the charts. Think of it as some good career karma. And as always, if you want to learn more about the topics we discussed today or are ready to take massive action and invest in yourself and your career, we would be honored to help you. Head on over to recruittheemployer.com/call to book your free strategy session. Regardless, we will see you next week.